Hello guys, and welcome to a new Wargame Airland battle video today by me, Vulcan. Today I'm doing the first of the armoury tutorials, and that is of the logistics vehicles. And to start off with, I'll be going through all of the command vehicles and the supply vehicles, as well as taking a look at the use of the FOBs and command vehicle helicopters, and also of course supply helicopters. So some of you guys have been waiting for these for a while, and one will be coming out every Monday from now on, so look out for them then. But thanks for being patient. It took me a while to get through every single unit by myself and have a look at them all and work out which ones are the best. So today I'm just going to start off with the logistics units on the NATO side, and then I'll do the pack side later on after I've completed all of the NATO infantry supply, support, tanks, recon, vehicle, helicopter and planes. So let's get started. The first unit we have to look at today is the M38A1CP. Now this is a command jeep which is exactly the same as the M201PC, the M151A1KV and the M151A1CP. They all have exactly the same stats, and that is the fact that they have an off-road speed of 55 kilometers per hour. This is not the best, and I would never ever recommend bringing in one of these vehicles. Now the reason for that is because they are unarmoured, completely unarmoured for starts. They can't move very fast, so they won't be able to get away from advancing enemy troops very easily. And the only reason I could suggest that you maybe bring them in is because you're using a specific deck, a specific nation deck, and you need a small vehicle to hide in hedgerows in specific sectors. But other than that, I would always suggest going for an armoured CV. So remember that these are exactly the same: the Canadian one, the French one, the Danish one and the American one. All of these command jeeps are exactly the same. So moving on, we've got the M577. This is very similar to the M577 Danish vehicle, and also the Americans have another similar version, and also the Germans. So this is a favoured CV of mine, depending on what deck I'm going for. Basically, it has a very nice front armour, it has no more armaments, and it has an off-road speed of 60 kilometers per hour. Now the armour is good because it allows it to run away from light arms fire without too much problems, and it also has a strength of 10, which is 10 hit points, so it can take a bit of a beating. Furthermore, it's unlikely to be killed by splash damage from bombs and other nearby explosions, whereas if you were to use a car or a jeep, then it's likely that if an explosion goes off nearby, you're going to lose your CV in that sector, which can be very annoying, whereas you're going to need a direct hit on an armoured vehicle to destroy it, unless it's one of those heavy 1,000-pound bombs that some planes can drop. Then you've got a Grizzly CP. This has a speed of 100 kilometers per hour off-road and is armoured as well. It has a M2 Browning as its weapon of choice, which has an accuracy of 3 and a suppression rating of 90, which is pretty good, but the rate of fire really lets it down, so be careful with this. It's never a weapon that you're going to be using to defend it. Literally the only reason you'd be ever using this machine gun is if you're running away from infantry and you need something to fire at them, because otherwise your CV will die. I much prefer units without weapons for command vehicles, purely because they don't give away their own position. So if it's sitting in a hedge line or maybe in some forest somewhere, if you have a weapon on your CV, it will automatically fire at anything nearby if you don't turn off the weapon system. And that can often give away the position of your CV, and then all they have to do is bring in a plane while you're not looking and bomb it, and that's GG. And that happens a lot in ranked games, so you have to be very careful of your placement of your CV and make sure it's well defended, because CV sniping in ranked games is a very big thing. And I can imagine people using the Grizzly CP a reasonable amount, because it has that 100 km/h speed off-road and is armoured, so it could come in handy. It's very, very similar to the VAB PC, which has less armour but has a speed of 90 km/h, so it's a little bit slower and has less armour, but also costs a bit less if you're trying to save points. Then we've got the Command Leopard C1. Now this is the first of many command tanks. Command tanks are a unit you use for contesting sectors. That is their primary, I would say their primary use. Now the reason for this is because they have incredible armour for a command vehicle, and also a weapon that allows them to defend themselves really well. And what you can do, for instance, say on the map Ragnarok, which is the big 10v10 map, you're pushing up with a line of tanks. You keep the CV tank at the back, of course. Once you push over the ridge into the middle of the map, there is a supply point that allows them to reinforce directly onto your own forces. If you have a command tank with you, what you can do is you can push the command tank up into the sector, and you can sit there and deny them of reinforcements in that particular sector that you're attacking, making it a lot easier to take it over, rather than having reinforcements constantly coming in and attacking your own forces while you can't reinforce yourself. So that's what command tanks are really, really good for. Now, they obviously can't defend themselves that well, and it often depends on the actual tank which can defend themselves better. But the Leopard C1 is not one of them. It's not very good at all. However, the PZBEFWG Leopard 2, however, can defend itself very well, because it's completely different, a lot more front armour, but we'll get to that in a second. Now the Leopard C1 has 10 front armour, which is its best armour stat on the vehicle, and we got strength of 10 hit points, and a speed of 65 km/h. Now that is a reasonable amount. It's even faster than the M577 and also the M38A1, so it's reasonably good at getting around. And if you can afford it, if it's late in a game, then it might be worth bringing it in just to be safe, just to replace one of your old command vehicles, make sure that they don't get sniped out, because later in the game you can have more points to spend. Now, moving on to the first of the supply vehicles, we have the Alvis Stalwart. Now this is exactly the same as the Amphib Beetle 101, which is a Swedish version. If you look, they are exactly the same, they just have a different camo. Personally, I prefer the Swedish camo, but there we go. They have a speed of 90 km/h, which is reasonably fast, but they only have a fuel capacity of 750 litres and a strength of 5. Now, these are really good for nation-specific decks, like for the British and for the Swedish. But other than that, there are units that are a lot better at providing fuel than the Alvis Stalwart. So I will get to them in a second, but for now I wouldn't recommend having these on an all nations deck, and make sure in general with supply vehicles that you keep them spread out, because they can chain explode, as some of you probably already know. So we got the M201 PC. This is obviously the same as the M38A1 CP, so I'm not going to go into it too much. We then have the VAB PC. I've already talked about this briefly. Very similar to the Grizzly CP, except from it's slower and has less armor but costs less. So if you want to save a bit of money on an all nations deck, instead of getting the Grizzly CP, you can always go for the VAB PC. It's still armoured, so it still survives from light arms fire and is protected from AoE explosions, but is not as effective for front armour if it comes across any light recoilless rifles, for instance. But that's never going to really happen, so you can always save your points by doing that. And especially in a 1v1 ranked where you only have 1,500 points to start, you're not going to want to waste too many points on your CVs at the start. So it's always something to work out, and it still has the strength of 10, the 10 hit points, so it will survive and it can get away as easily as the Grizzly CP. Then we got the AMX-30B CNE. Now I kind of like this tank for the way it can defend itself, and it is reasonably fast. It has 70 km/h speed, but the annoying thing about it is, even though it's a command tank, it has barely any armor compared to other tanks that you can get. So for instance, this costs 200 points. You get 6 front armor, you get a speed of 70 km/h, which is very, very good. But compared to, for instance, the Chieftain Mark 10, which has 14 front armor, or the Leopard 2, which has 15 front armor, and a gun that has an accuracy of 7 and AP power of 16, compared to the AP power of 11 and accuracy of 8. To be honest, command tanks need to be able to stay alive in contested sectors, and that is the only reason that I would ever use one. Now obviously there are different uses for them. For example, you could just use them anyway to secure sectors, just to be safe, but the point is, I would never use an AMX-30B, because even if it was hidden in the forest or in a tree line and infantry stuck up on it, it's still going to take a one shot into the side armor at close range. Whereas, for instance, the Leopards and the Chieftain has an 8 side armor, and the Leopard has 6, and even the Centurion has 4, and it costs less than the AMX-30B. So not one I would recommend for use as a command vehicle, although it has nice armaments to defend itself. So yeah, let's move on. Now obviously, like I said before, the M151 151A1 KV is exactly the same as the other two Jeeps. And then we got the M113A1 CP. Now this is the same as the M114A1, pretty much, as you can see. If I hover over that and then hover over this one, you can see the only difference really is the front armor. But yeah, let's go over this. So we got an M2 Browning as defense, but you got a speed of 65 km/h. You got the 1 front armor, 1 side armor, 1 rear armor, and 1 top armor. Tells you it's armored and will survive the splash damage, and has a strength of 10. So reasonably good. Basically very similar to the VAB PC, but the reason I would take the VAB PC over the M113A1 any day is because of the speed. Allows it to get away from the enemy very, very quickly. It also has a much larger autonomy, which allows the VAB PC to move around the map a lot more efficiently and won't run out of fuel when you don't want it to. Also, the optics can pay dividends when you are in a sector and infantry are sneaking up on you. The VAB can actually spot them, but the M113A1 can't very well until it's basically too late. But they both host a medium size, so either way you're going to be able to hide in the same sort of hedge lines and tree lines. Now that's a good thing about these CPs, I think I already mentioned in the Jeeps, is that because they're small, you can get away with hiding them in very, very weird places. Anyway, the Centurion. Now this is one of my favourite command tanks because it has 8 front armour and 4 side armour. It's very cheap for a command tank, 170 points. It's the cheapest, other than the M48 Patton, cheapest command tank which has a reasonable armour and a good armament for defending itself at close range. So it still has the HE power of 3 on its cannon that every other tank has, and that means that if an infantry unit sneaks up on it, it's going to be able to just shoot it straight up. But it's cheap, and it has the 8 armour and 4 side armour, which will allow it to take probably a hit in the side and not particularly die. It depends on obviously what's shooting at it and how much AP power the enemy infantry unit has, but that 4 side armour is going to do very well. The only bad thing about this CV is it's one of those ones that you would leave in an old sector. Now, I know I said that command tanks are used for contesting sectors. I would never do it with this particular tank. If you were going to use command tanks to defend your old sectors in ranked 1v1, then this would be the one I would choose. It has a speed of 35 kilometers per hour, so it's not going to be going anywhere soon. But for attacking enemy sectors, I would always be using the Leopard 2s or Chieftain Mark 10s. So what you can do on some particular decks, on All Nations deck, is have the Centurions and, for instance, a Leopard, like CVs, on your deck at the same time. So you have 2 CV tanks on your deck, and then that basically makes it extremely good at pressuring the enemy in particular sectors and allowing yourself to gain an advantage. So, with that in mind, we'll look at the Rover CP. Now, the big difference with these Rover CP and the Iltis Kado is their speed off-road. So the Rover CP, you can see, has a 95 km per hour speed off-road, and the Iltis Kado has a speed of 110 km per hour off-road. I would always take the Iltis Kado over the Rover CP any day because it has the 110 km per hour speed. This is extremely useful for getting out of danger, and the small size allows you to hide it in anywhere the same as any of the other command jeeps, except from it's just a million times faster. It has the small size and the optics of medium, so it's going to be able to spot any infantry crossing open ground towards it, and it has an autonomy of 700 kilometers, which is perfectly enough for any command jeep. Whereas the Rover CP, now although it's British and I would prefer to take it probably, it has a worse autonomy and worse speed, but it costs exactly the same. So if you're going for an All Nations deck and you want a jeep, I would always recommend the Iltis though. It's definitely the best command jeep that you can get. Now, the M577G, this is the first of, well, the German armoured command vehicle. Is exactly the same as the M577 that I already talked about earlier. Then we got the Leopard 2. Now, like I've already said, 15 front armour, speed of 70 kilometers per hour, extremely good manoeuvrability for getting itself out of trouble. So if you're pushing up into a contested sector and things go south, then it allows you to get this out of there very, very easily, very quickly, with the 70 km per hour speed off-road. The 15 front armour will make it survive from ATGMs, and 6 side armour will basically stop it from being killed by snuck-up infantry. So, one of the best command tanks, probably the best command tank that you can access, other than the Chieftain Mark 10. So definitely something to think about, but does have the size of big, So you're not going to be hiding it anywhere other than heavy cover. So bear that in mind. But it does host a nice gun with the accuracy of 7, AP power of 16, can defend itself against enemy tanks, and also obviously the HE power of 3 that every tank has. Now I missed the Sultan, so let's go back to that. Now the Sultan's another favourite of mine. Now the reason for it is it's a fast armoured command vehicle. It has a speed of 80 km per hour, has a GPMG as its main weapon, but as you can see, compared to other armoured vehicles, it has a worse speed. So if we look at the Grizzly CP, you've got the same armour, but it's slightly slower. So we're probably looking at a vehicle that's decent for a nation-specific deck, but maybe not the best for an all-nations deck. Depends obviously what you want, but it still has the size of medium. It's exactly the same optics of medium, speed of 80 km per hour, so reasonably fast, and the road speed is actually slower than both the Grizzly CP and the VAB PC. Now we've got the Chieftain Mark 10. The Chieftain Mark 10 is an extremely good command vehicle. It only hosts 1 less front armour than the Leopard 2. It has 2 more side armour than the Leopard 2. And this is extremely good for keeping it alive in contested sectors. Now the gun is pretty much just as powerful. A lot more accurate with an accuracy of 9 and an AP power of 15 compared to the AP power of 16 on the Leopard 2. But the stabilizer is worse, so it's generally going to be sitting still anyway. But the biggest thing with the Chieftain Mark 10 compared to the Leopard 2 is the speed. The speed of the Leopard 2 is 70 km per hour. The speed of the Chieftain Mark 10 is 40 km per hour. And you're probably wondering why I'm focusing so much on speed with command vehicles. Now, the biggest thing that catches people out is when people use infantry, or if people sneak up on your command vehicle. If you don't have a good enough speed, you're never going to get away. However, if you do, then you're going to be flying away and you're going to be laughing. If you don't, then you're going to be crying. And speed is a huge factor in keeping your CV safe, and also for getting to sectors faster than your enemies. And you can match the speed of your CV with the speed of your own units, for instance your infantry APCs, allowing it to be defended properly if it gets ahead of the rest of the force. So it's always something worth thinking about, at least. So the Chieftain Mark 10, in my opinion, is the best command tank for contested sectors, and the Centurion is the best command tank for defending old sectors that aren't necessarily under immediate threat. So let's move on. We got the Rover KPV, exactly the same as the Rover CP. We got the M577 KPV, exactly the same as the M577G and M577. Then we got the M48A5 command tank. Not my favourite command tank, purely because of its lack of armour completely. It basically has 2 less front armour and 1 less side armour than the Centurion, and only costs 5 less points, which to me isn't worth it. It's faster than the Centurion, but again, I would rather use a completely different tank altogether, or command vehicle altogether, for the speed. Now it does obviously have a cannon that can defend itself reasonably well, but not something that I would place any bets on, especially with the size of big. Now that's the good thing about this Chieftain Mark 10 actually that I forgot to mention. It only has a size of medium, allowing it to basically hide in similar places to the armoured CVs like the VAB PC. Whereas the Leopard 2 and the Centurion are both big, and furthermore so is the M48A5. Not something I would recommend getting in an all nations deck. Obviously, depending on what you're doing with a is that Norwegian? Yes, Norwegian deck, then you may take it. But we got the M15 1A1 CP, similar to all the other Jeeps. We've got the Humvee here, another Jeep with no armor, but a bit faster. Also has an armament to keep it self-defended, but again, for a Jeep with no armor, I definitely recommend the Iltis Kado. You don't want that machine gun purely because it will give away its position. Good if it's defending itself against helicopters, but you shouldn't be in that position, and you should always have something defending your CV. The M114A1, very similar to the M113A1, but is slower, but has better front armor. So you got the same machine gun, but you got poor optics, you got speed of 60 kilometers per hour, you got the same front armor as other armored CVs, but it's slower. So you're not going to be doing very well with this particular CV compared to other ones. Now, it only costs 130 compared to the 135 of, for instance, the VAB PC, or the 150 of the Grizzly CP. But again, I'm going to continue to stress that I think the Grizzly CP is currently the best CV, armoured CV in the game. And we got the M577, already mentioned, and of course the M60. Now, again, this is very similar to the M48, but has a bit better front armour, but costs 30 more points than the Centurion. And if we look at the stats, yes, the stats are pretty different in terms of the main gun being a lot better for the M60. But in all honesty, if I'm going to hit 200 points, then I'm always going to jump to 220 points and get a Chieftain. Whereas if I'm keeping it under 200 points, then I'm always going to take a Centurion. Those are the two biggest point differences that I'm going to make. It's still a big size, so it can't hide itself very well. You've got a strength of 10, which will give it 10 HP, which is reasonable. And we got a speed of 50 kilometers per hour, not going to save itself if it gets caught out. So not something I would recommend looking into at all. It would be nice if there was an Abrams CV, but unfortunately there isn't. Now we got the Stab Stuggeber 1313. Not something I would recommend using. It has 100 km per hour speed, but it has a size of medium for an unarmored command vehicle, and it kind of defeats the object of the fact that it's unarmored. It can't hide itself as well as a Jeep, for instance, so it's just going to get spotted and it's going to get destroyed very easily, although it does have 100 km per hour speed, so it will be able to get out of trouble, but still, the Iltis Kado can still go faster. Now we've got the Strip BV 3021, a very strange looking command vehicle, that's for sure. Comes with a 20mm autocannon for its defense, which is reasonable, but again, for an armored command vehicle, I wouldn't recommend having an armament, or at least if you do, turn it off, because it's going to give away its position. Now the good thing about a 20mm autocannon though, is that it can defend itself against APCs. Now that's something I haven't thought about really, because often people rush Fuchs, for instance, into your base, and Fuchs can be very damaging to CVs that don't have the armament to attack back. So if you're going to be threatened by that kind of thing and you don't have your CV protected, then using a CV like this with a 20mm autocannon on it will do very well for you. However, don't rely on it too much, because I can pretty much assure you that if somebody's got an APC that close, they're just going to jump out some infantry and the rocket's going to kill you anyway. Especially considering this only has one side armor compared to the two side armor of the Grizzly CP. So, not something I would recommend using in a all nations deck. The Striss TRV 103B, it's again a tank. It costs too much for what it is. It's a small command vehicle, which is really nice. It's the only tank command vehicle in the game that is small in terms of size, which allows it to hide in crazy places. It has 12 front armor and 4 side armor, but I don't like the price of it. The idea of a contesting command vehicle is that it can defend itself and it can fight other vehicles off. This vehicle doesn't have the armor it needs to do that for the price it costs. It costs 210 when you can get a Chieftain Mark 10 for 220 with a much better gun. So to me this is overpriced, and I think the reason it is overpriced is because it's small, which allows it to act like a Jeep command vehicle and hide in very, very strange places. It doesn't look that small, but I believe it's like the shape of it. Somebody mentioned in my Swedish video that makes it good at hiding. So yeah, accuracy of 7, AP power of 12, not as good as other command tanks for the price. We've got a speed of 50 kilometers per hour, not going to be going anywhere fast, so be wary of that. So now we're moving on to the supply vehicles. We've got the M35 Cargo. This is exactly the same as the M621 Logic and also the M35 Cargo of the Canadians. It only has a fuel capacity of 500, but obviously useful if you need to have plenty of supply trucks on your deck to keep all your units or HEMTTs, for instance, resupplied. But speed of 90 off-road is very nice, and it can get to everywhere you need to. Definitely a recommendation if you want to keep it cheap on the supply vehicle side of things. Then we got the HEMTT. This has a fuel capacity of 1,500 litres. I believe this has the biggest fuel capacity of all of the ground supply vehicles. So that's what it's really good for, and it is armoured. Has 1 front armour, 1 side armour, 1 rear armour. No top armour though, so it will still die to planes and helicopters just as easily. So if that happens, then you never want these next to another HEMTT. You always bring these on their own and you spread them out, because otherwise you're going to lose a lot of points in supply vehicles. And that's why I don't prefer using them. I used to use them a lot in Wargame European Escalation, because they have that strength of 10, which is the HP. 10 HP is very, very good for a supply vehicle. Then we've got the speed of 60 kilometers per hour, which you can get around very, very easily, but it's big and it gets spotted. And in Wargame Airland battle, that means planes come in and they blow things up, whereas in European Escalation you didn't have to worry about that so much. And the 35 points for the vehicle is very, very tasty for anyone in a 1v1, so be wary of that, because people will take advantage of it by destroying any little thing that they can. And if it's a 10-point command vehicle then or supply vehicle, you don't care, but if it's a HEMTT, you're going to start caring. So moving on, we got the MD Jupiter, one of my favourite supply vehicles, purely because of its fuel capacity. It only has 250 less litres of fuel than the HEMTT, but it costs a whole 15 points less for a supply vehicle. Has a speed of 70 kilometers per hour, which is more than the HEMTT has. But the biggest difference here is that it's not as strong and it's not armoured. So it's going to get blown up. But I would recommend taking these because they're really good at spreading out behind your own forces. And although they die, you're not as concerned about a 20 point loss than a 35 point loss. And trust me, with the armament that people are going to be using to destroy your supply vehicles, the HEMTT's going to die just as quickly as the Jupiter is anyway. So don't be too worried about that. Also, the Jupiter is smaller, which allows it to hide in different hedge lines and forests that the HEMTT can't. So there's also that to bear in mind. Now, we move on to the Man-Catty 6x6. This is similar to the HEMTT, except from it has no armour. And this is shown by the fact that it costs 5 points less. It has exactly the same fuel capacity, exactly the same everything else, except from the armour. So it's up to you if you want to bring this in, but I wouldn't recommend it. If you're going to bring in a supply vehicle that costs this much, I would spend 5 points more and get the HEMTT, because it's the only armoured ground supply vehicle that you can get. Whereas if you don't want to go that expensive, then get the Jupiter, because it provides a lot of fuel capacity for its cost. Now we've got the VLRA Logistic. These are reasonably good. They cost 5 more points than the cargoes, but the only difference is that they carry 250 more litres. So depending on the situation, you might want to spend 5 more points, but again, I would recommend bringing in M35 cargoes, because they're so cheap that people don't bother taking them out, and if they do, then you don't care. Whereas say if you've got 4 M35 cargoes, that's 2,000 fuel capacity. That costs you 40 points. If you're bringing in 4 VLRAs, that's going to cost you 60 points. And if they get chain blown up when you're not looking, you're going to be annoyed. 60 points is a lot to invest in supply vehicles. Bear that in mind. Now, this Jupiter for the Danish is exactly the same as the MD Jupiter that I already looked at. So we're going to move straight on to the CH-147. This is a Chinook, exactly the same as the Super Chinook, basically the Canadian version of the Super Chinook. They both have a strength of 8 and a speed of 300 kilometers per hour, so they're going to get to the front line very, very quickly. They have the largest fuel capacity in the game, I believe, of 2,000 litres, which is extremely useful. Actually, I believe the Pact have a larger helicopter for supply, but for the NATO, the Super Chinook has the largest fuel capacity out of any of the supply vehicles. It is big though, and can get spotted. It becomes a huge target when it comes onto the battlefield. People will always try and snipe these out of the sky with planes, and they will always try to bomb them when they're on the ground. It happens a lot, so be wary of that. I don't like using Super Chinooks purely because they are magnets for being destroyed. As soon as people see them, they get annihilated. So the best way to use a Super Chinook is to keep them way behind your own lines and land them down and then send units back to them to resupply. If you keep them near the front lines, then you're just asking for them to be destroyed, and for 65 points, it's completely not worth it. Now, the fuel capacity is 2,000 litres. If you think about the difference here, a HEMTT, or let's say an MD Jupiter, costs 20 points and gives you 1,250 litres. A CH-147 gives you 2,000 litres, but costs a whole, look at that, 45 points more for 750 litres. So you have to be very careful. Now the Chinook, 30 kilometers per hour slower, but a fuel capacity of 1,500 litres. So you're losing 500 litres. But it costs 500 points less, and these are a lot less of a target than the Super Chinooks. So something to bear in mind. I like using the Chinooks as my supply helicopters in any deck. Then we got the HKP-4A, which is the Swedish supply helicopter. Has a fuel capacity of 800 litres, not very big at all for a helicopter, but only costs 25 points. So these are extremely good for emergency supply. So for example, in the Swedish deck that I was using, my fuel ran out very quickly, but because of these HKPs, I could get them there very quickly and resupply very quickly, which was extremely useful for keeping me on the move. Then we got the Puma 330B PC. This is the first of a couple of command helicopters that you have access to. Command helicopters are one thing that's extremely hard to get to grips with on Wargame at Land Battle, because they are such a big target. As soon as people see a command helicopter flying around, they will do everything in their power to destroy it. And that includes planes being able to shoot it down while it's flying around. We've got, when it's landed, it's going to get bombed and it won't be able to take off quick enough. So they're very risky. But the reason you use a command vehicle, or a command helicopter, sorry, is to get to a position quickly. So a reinforcement point, for example. You have a couple of helicopters or a few helicopters to go with it to defend it. Just be careful of aircraft, of course, and land it as quickly as you can at a reinforcement point that's near to the enemy, and then bring in reinforcements from that point. That's what they're good for. Otherwise, they're not useful at all. Because if you have them in a frontline sector, they're always going to get either RT'd, because they're pretty obvious. They can't hide in trees like other command vehicles can, because they're obviously helicopters. They can't even hide in hedgerows. They have to sit in the middle of a field. And that's where coming into the Puma and the UH-1A differences is very important. Now the Puma 330 PC costs 10 more points than the UH-1A, but the reason it costs more is because of the speed mainly. It has a strength of 6, a speed of 250 km per hour, the fastest out of the two of them. But as you can probably see, it also has a better strength, which means it can stay alive. But the size is medium, so it's going to get spotted in the middle of the field pretty easily. Fuel capacity of 100,000 litres, useful to keep it around for the entire game. The UH-1A is small and has less health, and I would much prefer using these than the Pumas. Now the reason for that is because this hides itself in a sector very easily if you park it behind a tree line. So you can do the same with a Puma, but because the Puma has a medium size and it's still in the middle of the field, it's going to get spotted. Something that's small in the middle of the field behind some trees will be less likely to get spotted. So something to definitely bear in mind if you're going to use any kind of command helicopter. I would definitely recommend this one. Yes, it's slower, but unfortunately it's not going to make too much of a difference. The good thing about it being slow though is that you can get your helicopters that are defending it up in front of it very quickly. So the last thing we're looking at today is the Puma supply vehicle. We've got speed of 300 km per hour, very quick, and a fuel capacity of 1,000 litres. Very nice command or supply helicopter, sorry. Useful for getting to the front line very quickly. I think it's one of the fastest supply helicopters that you can get. The same speed as the Super Chinook, but costs less than half the price and still provides you with half the fuel capacity. So this is like a very low risk supply helicopter and very useful in the front lines. Definitely my supply helicopter of choice, because 20 points more for a Chinook is not really worth it when you can get the extra speed, and it's also smaller, which keeps it alive longer. Finally, we've got the FOBs. Now FOBs are a strange one. They are useful depending on the deck you use. If you're going for an all-in deck, you don't need an FOB, so don't even think about it. I would never recommend in a 1v1 taking more than one FOB. It's never really going to be a good idea because you're wasting too much points on supply. FOBs, useful for big matches where you've got like 2v2, 3v3, 4v4 and 10v10. Useful for that, especially if you want to keep a lot of arty on your deck. But if you're going for 1v1, never take more than one. And obviously it doesn't matter what nation you take it for because they're all exactly the same. So that was an extremely long look at the logistics units for the NATO side. Hopefully it was useful. I honestly didn't realise that it would take this long, but hopefully the infantry I will be just as thorough as I was in this one, and hopefully, like I said, it was useful and helpful. So yeah, thanks for watching guys. I'm not going to drag this out any further, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.